Okay.
This is a women's spiritual pilgrimage, panel D. We're speaking with Laura Shannon, grandmother of the worldwide Sacred Circle Dance Network, researching and teaching traditional women's circle dances for over 30 years. She holds degrees in dance movement therapy, intercultural studies, myth, cosmology, and the sacred, and is a PhD candidate at the University of Gloucester. She's a faculty member of the Findhorn Foundation Sacred Dance Department, founding director of the Athena Institute for Women's Dance and Culture, honorary lifetime member of the Sacred Dance Guild, and as Carol P. Christ's literary executor, Laura will work to preserve Carol's literary legacy. As the new director of the Ariadne Institute for the Study of Myth and Ritual, she will continue leading Carol's goddess pilgrimage on Crete. So welcome, Laura, and I hope this works for us now.
Thank you, Francesca. Thank you, everyone, and welcome. So let me just go and share my screen for you now. You see that okay now?
Yes, we can.
Thank you very much. Pilgrim of the Goddess, Carol P. Christ and her life in Greece. Carol Christ led groups on her goddess pilgrimage to Crete more than 40 times from 1995 to 2019. These tours brought over 600 women to the magical landscape of Crete, where archaeological sites reveal a Bronze Age culture based on egalitarian matriarchal societies of peace which honored the goddess. We know from the work of Maria Gimburas that Eastern Crete is where the matrifocal cultures of old Europe survived the longest, after Indo-European incursions had overwhelmed similar societies in Eastern Europe and the rest of Greece. The people of Bronze Age Crete lived in peace and prosperity, with reverence for nature and the cycles of life, and honored a goddess of life, death, and regeneration. Their artworks celebrated the joy of life and the beauty of the earth and did not glorify violence or war. On the goddess pilgrimage, which Carol created, we are invited to immerse ourselves in the landscapes, art, ideas, and sacred sites of this ancient civilization, and to come into contact with the goddess at the center of this world. The power Carol called the intelligent embodied love that is in all being. The experience of this loving intelligence, expressed and embodied in the landscape of Crete, invites us to let go of old patterns of fear and pain and remake our lives in alignment with love. Carol Christ was an ideal guide on this journey, having gone through this process of releasing and remaking her own life when she found the goddess and moved to Greece. In her book, A Serpentine Path, originally titled Odyssey with the Goddess, Carol tells how the goddess tours began. She describes how she came to live in Greece and the pain she faced early on with her mother's death and a bitter heartbreak. When she traveled to Crete with several friends, including Mara and Naomi, on the trip which ultimately led to the goddess pilgrimage, she was carrying emotional pain, which felt unbearable. Oh dear. Here we go. Okay. Yeah. She was carrying emotional pain which felt unbearable, and she was feeling terribly alone. With brutal honesty, Carol wrote that she did not feel loved, she did not want to live, could not write, and believed the goddess had betrayed her faith. But after she completed the journey and the book, Carol wrote, "Though my life has had its ups and downs since then, as all lives do, I have never forgotten that I am loved. I have wanted to live. I have not stopped writing, and I feel the goddess present in my body, in my breath, and in my connections with the living and the dead. Though my story is deeply personal, my struggles with love and death, trust and control, are widely shared." With this extraordinary book, Carol was a pioneer of spiritual memoir and narrative theology, but in the pain she felt, she was not alone. Many women suffer in a culture where females, mothers, the earth, and the body are not respected, and find it hard to be a woman. in a woman-hating world. Carol's move to Greece was sparked by a profound intuitive longing which many women share to connect with living remnants of an ancient culture where women and the goddess were revered. She needed to get out of her academic job in, quote, an institutional structure that favored objective tests over real learning, and away from the American culture that sapped the life energy she felt so strongly in Greece. Her courageous commitment to move to Greece, following her heart and her love for the goddess, allowed her to discover her authentic voice and move beyond the objective third-person voice of traditional scholarship into a more poetic, rhythmic, and grounded style of writing. Carol found healing in her encounters with the goddess through ritual at sacred sites, in her commitment to teaching others, and in Aphrodite's gifts of love and beauty, which she bravely brought into her life as principles to live by. Through her immersion in love and beauty as a priestess of Aphrodite, she finally came to feel whole, alive, and at peace with the world. Carol's intense personal relationship to the goddess helped her move through the feelings which had overwhelmed her before. The emotional breakdown she describes in her book was a terrifying experience of feeling thrown in at the deep end. Yet at that moment of sink or swim, Carol learned to swim. And through the goddess pilgrimage, Carol was able to transmute the loneliness and desperation of her own struggle into valuable teachings for other women through the rituals she created for tour participants. Can I just ask if we could mute the people who aren't speaking and we won't have so much background noise? Thank you so much, everyone. Carol wrote, "Because we're all connected to each other, I know that the path to the mystery I discovered is not mine alone. With her sister pilgrims, she walked the labyrinth, singing, 'There is a path to the mystery, and as I walk, it's revealed to me.'" Carol led her tours the way she lived her life, as a spiritual pilgrim, moving beyond pain with the help of ritual at sacred sites which she saw as actual portals for initiation. The path of pilgrimage led her through what she called the darkness, not in the sense of dark being bad, but in the literal sense of not being able to see the way ahead, and yet she found she could follow the path, even when she could not see it. The initiation she experienced led her to a profound understanding of the dance of light and darkness, and the natural cycle of endless movement between the two. In her words, "The serpentine path is the path of life, a snake-like meandering path, winding in and out, up and down, with no beginning and no end, into the darkness, into the light." Her hard-won knowledge of life's ups and downs gave her the authority to guide other women to connect with this source of power. Carol led her students in the fierce certainty that no matter how deep the darkness, no matter how hard it is to see, with the help of the goddess, we can find a way through. For Carol, the solutions to these mysteries always came back to love. She spoke with gratitude of the abundant love she received from and felt for her mother and grandmothers. The experience of her mother's love helped her easily imagine a loving mother goddess of pre-Christian times, whose face she could also recognize in the Greek Orthodox Panagia, the all-holy Mother of God. She felt the power of the Christian Divine Mother, particularly at the sacred myrtle tree of Paliani. Carol's special connection with Aphrodite inspired her to move beyond pain and live her life with love. Carol showered love on her little dogs, on her friends and her friends' children. She loved animals and birds. Her deep love of nature inspired her activism to protect the wetlands of Lesbos, which Mara talked about, and to stand for office twice as a candidate for the Green Party in Greece. She expressed love in many concrete ways, helping refugees and supporting numerous women's groups and environmental organizations. And she walked in beauty, with beauty around her, in the exquisitely tasteful homes she created in Molivos and in Heraklion, and of course in her beautiful garden. She loved and was loved by her many friends around the world, and especially in Crete, where she became part of the families of the women she visited every year. Oh, what happened? I've lost my picture, I don't know why. Okay, I hope you can see that now.
Yes.
Thank you. Her friends there opened their homes to the women who came with her on the goddess pilgrimage, in encounters which were valuable and meaningful for all. The welcome and sense of belonging Carol found in these communities was very precious to her. Just weeks before she passed away, Carol completed her article about the archaeological site of Gournia in eastern Crete. Many of us who were here today were present at the Symposium of the Association for the Study of Women in Mythology, where just a few days after her death, we heard the deeply moving recording of Carol's voice, reading a short version of her Gournia paper. Beginning from the hypothesis that ancient Crete was matriarchal, matrifocal, and matrilineal, and drawing on evidence from existing egalitarian matriarchies, which, in the words of Heidegger Abendroth, view the earth as a great and giving mother, Carol paints a persuasive picture of women's leadership in the religion and culture of Bronze Age Crete. In this article, her embodied thinking and impeccable scholarship build a firm bridge between archaeological interpretation and spiritual understanding. In the way she succeeds in balancing the academic objective voice with the deep inner knowing of her subjective experience as a pilgrim to the goddess.
One minute.
Thank you. Carol's life as a pilgrim can be said to have reached its goal. Some months before she died, Carol wrote in her blog, "I am not afraid of death. I believe death is the ordinary ending of life. I do not expect life after death or rebirth. I do not fear judgment or punishment. I was present when my mother died and felt her embraced by love. I expect to experience this love when I die. I believe that in death I will be returned to the arms and body of the Blessed Mother who has sustained my life." Carol was one of my closest friends, an amazingly supportive mentor, and the most brilliant mind I've ever met. I miss her more than I can say. Her legacy lives on in her writings and in the path of pilgrimage she created on Crete. Following in her footsteps, we too can know the loving embrace of the goddess and travel the labyrinth of life, death, and rebirth, which is above all a path of love. This is the gift of the goddess of Crete. This is the gift of Carol Christ.
Thank you, Laura.
Thank you.
If you could give us back the main page, please. I'll introduce the next speaker, which is Irene Plunkett. She works on the higher education project of Veritas, creating webinars promoting the use of labyrinths in colleges and universities. She sits on their board as well. Currently a student at the Chaplaincy Institute, Irene is studying spiritual direction and chaplaincy. She is retired from a 30-year career in teaching English, ESL, English as a second language, women's studies and religious studies at Chabot College in Oakland, California. She completed her doctorate in philosophy, religion, and women's spirituality at the California Institute of Integral Studies in San Francisco. So welcome, Irene.
Thank you. And thank you, Laura, for those wonderful images. My presentation is very text heavy, so it's great. As I'm speaking today, I just invite you to remember Mara's words this morning about Chris describing spiritual journey from nothingness, awakening, insight, and naming. I also invite you to think about your own life as a spiritual pilgrimage while I'm speaking, and to think about some literature that you especially enjoy. When I wrote this work, this is a shorter version of a longer thing. I did not choose esoteric literature. I chose popular women's literature as my basis. So in the women's spirituality movement, in circles large and small, we often speak about hearing ourselves into speech. This phrase is a way of reminding ourselves and each other that women's voices, literal and metaphorical, have too often been silenced or not allowed to be heard at all. And without speech, without expression, it is difficult, nearly impossible, to access one's creative voice. One remedy for that is to work against the tide, to express oneself anyway. But crucially, as this expression suggests, simply having an audience, that is someone or someone's to listen, is itself a part of the equation. Expression graces the listener, hearing honors the speaker, and thus encourages her. As it turns out, the same is true of writing. Having an audience of readers completes the process of writing for the author. And by acknowledging women's language, women's experiences, including the sacredness of the everyday and sometimes the need for solitude, Carol Christ helped to shape not only a literary legacy, but the language for understanding and revealing that legacy. Her work, especially diving deep and surfacing behind me, women writers on spiritual quest, has helped to shape a lens, create a lens through which we could see what was hiding in plain sight, a lineage of women's spiritual literature. In her work, Chris distinguishes between women's literature focusing on social questions and literature focusing on spiritual quests, which she defines as a woman's awakening to the depths of her soul and her position in the universe. A woman's spiritual quest includes moments of solitary contemplation, but it is strengthened by being shared. A woman must listen to her own voice to come to terms with her own experience. She must break long-standing habits of seeking approval, of trying to please others, but never herself. Chris words. The lens that Chris has shaped helps to understand, sometimes in retrospect, a group of US women writers that emerged mid-century, 20th century, a number of women whose spiritual quest demanded solitude and who ended up seeking that solitude and their souls alone on islands. Solitude itself is something that bears some scrutiny. When it is involuntary, in prison, for example, or the forced social isolation that occurs in some abusive domestic arrangements, it is harsh and punitive. When, however, it is chosen and desired, solitude can be a space of creativity, liberation, and soul fulfillment. While the first form of solitude is often thrust upon women, the second is perhaps less frequently seen, an option not quite forbidden, but not quite encouraged either. This paper looks at some women who chose solitude and then wrote about it from a spiritual perspective. The first work is nonfiction and the second is fiction. Thanks to Chris' work, their spiritual pilgrimage is more visible to us. In 1955, Anne Morrow Lindbergh wrote Gift from the Sea, maybe you know this work, and extended paean to the necessity of solitude for women, both for its own sake and for at least the possibility of development of spiritual and creative lives for women. As a woman aware of her own need for intellectual stimulation, she notes the difficulties for women, especially those who have chosen motherhood, to have any time set aside for contemplation. A married mother with several children, she finds herself alone at the beach for 2 weeks. Her prose shines with the joy of solitude, coupled with the awareness of its rarity and the need to maintain its gifts upon her return to her household. I'm going to skip the quote in the interest of time. Eventually, her task becomes centered on how to maintain the consciousness she has developed in this solitude when she returns to everyday life. She notes that the simplification of life is a step in the right direction and adds that she needs to find a way forward without renouncing her life completely. Much of Lindbergh's language is overtly religious. It is clear that this contemplative moment is important for her, that she is attempting to carve out some spiritual space that is key but which can neither be assumed nor taken for granted, and clearly does not exist in any present religious structure for her. She realizes that she will have to shed some of her Puritan conscience about absolute tidiness and cleanliness. And yet, throughout the book, she notes the primacy of this rare and precious experience of solitude and urgency of keeping its rewards, even if, ironically, she needs to overcome some of her own religious sensibilities in order to take this time to herself. And throughout this work, she reveals the depths of her soul and awareness, as Chris would say, of her place in the universe. Some other works that demonstrate this, it's a whole sort of subgenre, are An Unknown Woman, A Journey to Self-Discovery by Alice Kohler, 50 Days of Solitude by Doris Grumbach, A Year by the Sea, Thoughts of an Unfinished Woman, and Joan Anderson, Drinking the Rain. A much later work that works well with Chris' lens is Laurie King's Folly, published in 2001, a multi-layered postmodern novel that reveals and dwells in multiple realities. The main character, Ray Newborn's interior consciousness and her external life have become enmeshed with her ancestor's life and the story of his island house that Ray attempts to rebuild by herself. Accordingly, the book is arranged in many foundations, but the parts are clearing the ground, laying the foundation, building the walls, raising the roof beam, and housewarming. So notice the kind of spiritual resonance there. These headings refer ostensibly to the building project. As Ray, mostly single-handedly, rebuilds the house of her ancestors, she unravels the mystery of his death at great personal risk to herself. In the process, and with many setbacks, she also rebuilds her life and two relationships that are key for her, the one with her daughter and the other with her granddaughter. Most importantly, she regains her sanity and her soul and understands her place in the universe. Ray's story is a sad one. The death of her much beloved husband and daughter as a result of drunk driver and a subsequent violent sexual attack have left her on the verge of absolute collapse. Even before those events, she had suffered from depression. Though always independent and artistic, she becomes timid, hears voices, and struggles to regain her physical strength. With the help of a friendly and strong therapist, she manages to put together a life that seems to be working, but then the loss of her husband and daughter and the devastating personal attack have left her more vulnerable again. She's offered medication, but she explains that when she takes that medication, her creativity leaves her. So she chooses a life with pain and creativity over no pain and no creativity. Though a fictional character, like the non-fictional island writers I mentioned earlier, Ray is in her early 50s. Her dilemma reflects concern in popular literature that situate her not only in her own psychological morass, but also links her problems to the predatory nature of some males in this society. The attack by two strange men after the death of her husband and daughter is nearly more than she can take. Her relationship with her daughter, the child of her first marriage, and her granddaughter is hampered by her son-in-law's greed and insecurity. Her lawyer and her therapist form part of her stability. Her decision to go to the San Juan Islands and live on an island and rebuild her ancestors' house affords her ultimately the chance to find out a great deal about herself and her abilities. She finds she prefers to be away from the urban hub. She finds that her island is a protected bird sanctuary, something I think Carol would appreciate, and she decides to keep it that way. She is even able to confront by proxy the man responsible for the attacks on her. And when her daughter leaves her husband, she has a reunion with her and then is able to continue that relationship. Another profound healing takes place. Ray meets a man who has been secretly using one of the caves on her island as a hideout. Fearful at first that he is running drugs or worse, she listens to his story and finds out that he, in fact, is part of an underground network for children and women who are running away from abusive husbands and fathers. By the end of the book, this relationship shows promise of blooming into an egalitarian love affair with the added bonus of partnering in a new world that Ray finds morally sound. Unlike Lindbergh's Gift from the Sea, Kingsolver's Folly shows overt influences of the women's spirituality movement, highlighting Chris and others' themes of solitude, retreat, and spiritual maturity. For example, Ray notes each phase of the moon and listens happily to the full moon drumming ceremony that takes place each month on a neighboring island. When her daughter and granddaughter join her on the island for a stay, the three of them hold each other and cry over many things, including her daughter's impending divorce, clearly evoking the visual image of the maid, the mother, and the crone, who are reflected in the triple goddess, a key figure in much of pre-Christian Europe, and one that has been reclaimed by women in the women's spirituality movement of today.
1 minute.
And when the attacker invades the island to harm Ray, her fierceness carries an edge as she defends not only herself and her property, but becomes as fierce a warrior goddess as one can imagine. In the end, Ray is able to establish a connection, having located herself with other humans in need, as well as birds in need of sanctuary. Thus, Ray has used her solitude to rebuild her sanity and her life. In the process, she has created a safe space for other humans and other species, clearly indicating her new and sane place in the cosmos. So it is that one spiritually whole woman who has tended to herself can then heal and house others. Carol Christ's accomplishments were many, and her generosity to especially women scholars legendary. My own study of literature, in fact, my dissertation, owes her a debt. I know I'm not the only one. Thank you, Carol.
Thank you very much. Next, we have Susan Swan. Susan Swan is a novelist and an activist with international publications. Her fiction has been published in 18 countries and translated into 8 novels, 8 languages. Her 2004 novel, What Casanova Told Me, used Chris' work as background for writing about characters interested in goddess spirituality. In 2019, Swan published her 8th book of fiction, The Dead Celebrities Club, described in the Globe and Mail as a tale of greed, hubris, and fraud, a financial fable worthy of the age. The Wives of Bath, her international bestseller, was made into the feature film Lost and Delirious that premiered at Sundance and was shown in 32 countries. She was a tenured professor in creative writing at York University in Toronto before retiring from teaching. Welcome, Susan Swan.
Thank you, Francesca. It's an honor to be here today. And I'm going to talk to you about my personal relationship, my friendship with Carol, or Carolina, as she called herself when she was in Greece. And our relationship got off to a rocky start at the beginning because I was writing this novel, What Casanova Told Me, which is partly set in the 18th century and then in the 20th century. And the 20th century narrative had characters that were interested in goddess spirituality. And I wanted to find out more about it. I was very curious about it. And I knew from what I'd read that Carol was the portal to it, she and her trips to Minoan, Crete. So I wrote her and said, I would love to come to Crete. Would you, consider me one of the pilgrims? And she said, no, I don't want a professional writer coming on the tour because you might write a negative review of me and what I'm doing. And I said, well, no, that's not really what I'm interested in doing. I'm not interested in writing a review. I'm interested in finding out more. And if you will just let me come, I'll explain. So after a year of these conversations, she agreed. And I went to the Minoan Crete tour in 1995 in September. And it was, interesting to me. I knew I did have some reservations about Minoan Crete being an egalitarian matriarchal society. I thought maybe this was a projection of longings many of us have to, for the lack that we experience in our own culture, projecting it on an early society. Anyway, so that was the one point that Carolina was correct about, is that I did have this little reserve card, but I still had no intention of criticizing the pilgrimage. Anyway, when we met, it was a really astonishing experience. It was new for both of us to meet another 6'2" tall, blonde woman and look her in the eye. We had, you know, many similar, we were the same age, the same height. We had academic connections. I was a tenured prof in creative writing, and her academic life was much more scholarly. So we had these things in common, and we quickly moved from sort of shock to friendship, because what we really shared was this childhood, growing up to be a woman in the 50s, where to be a woman was to be, you know, like Sandra Dee, a movie actor at that time, you know, to be short, to be demure, that was the ideal. And so Carol and I both struggled as young women with our femininity. We, you know, had trouble accepting maybe that we were desirable, that we were the way we were supposed to be. And I believe that this kind of uneasiness with her body was a trigger, partly a trigger that led to her exploration of her religious philosophy, and which brought forward the new idea that the female body should be, there should be images, sacred images of the female body. And in my case, I was writing about characters always that had a certain uneasiness with their bodies. Either they had a hump on their shoulder, or they were too tall. I wrote a novel about a giantess and a swan with a distant relative. So we shared this astonishing history, and really our basic insecurities were the same. And my last, the last part of, I'm writing a memoir called Bigger, which is, the subtitle is A Memoir of Life with a Large Body. And the last part of it talks about Carol and our friendship and what it meant to me. And I told her about the memoir, and she wrote me this comment about our friendship. Though I knew that I was a head taller than many of my friends, I literally had no idea how I looked in the world, because there was no one to whom I could compare myself, since almost everyone else sees someone who is about her height, weight, and coloring every day. It is hard for others to imagine how strange it makes you feel not ever to see anyone who looks like you. I was about to turn 50 when I met you. Meeting you helped me overcome a lifetime of feeling that I was different from everyone else. We got to know each other first on the tour in 1995, and my reservations about her work quickly faded. No matter what one decides about Neolithic cultures, the tour of Minoan Crete was showing me how deeply entrenched a patriarchal view is in my own culture. So deeply entrenched that it was impossible for us to imagine a society without war and brutality. And yet, here was Minoan Crete, whose artifacts suggested it was an artistic, joyful society with seemingly no need of military fortresses. And I'm a little worried about time, so I'm just going to say that I think Carol was a true pioneer.
You still have 5 minutes.
What, I still have 5 minutes?
Yep.
Okay, thank you. A true revolutionary whose body of work is going to last for generations. And I'd like to read you briefly an excerpt from my memoir about going down into the cave with her. I'd been dreading the descent into the Scatino cave all morning. Carol believed Minoans worshipped a goddess in this cave, and she wanted the 20 women on our trip to experience what the Minoans experienced. At shrines like Gournia, Minoan offerings were left on the Kurno stone, an altar with 34 indentations for fruits of the harvest, So many of the women were bringing beans, garlic, tomatoes, and tourist trinkets to leave behind on the altars in the cave. I'd been told that the cave went down to a depth of more than 150 feet and had 4 separate levels. Since I was a child, I've been afraid of heights and the potential for loss of control, but a high place or a deep place in the earth implied. So I wasn't sure if I could handle it, especially since I had caught a cold on the plane to Greece. I didn't mention my nervousness to anyone. Blue is the color in Greece that wards off evil. And in rural areas, a blue eye is always pinned to the clothing of a baby when it is taken outside the house. For luck, I bought a blue glass eye from a tourist shop and vowed to take the cave 1 level at a time. Our group went first to a small Greek Orthodox church near the entrance to the cave. We lit candles and said prayers, and then down we went, accompanied by 2 Greek guides, both men. The first level of the cave was an enormous room with a benign rock formation. So far, so good. The second level turned out to be a smaller room with an alcove that sheltered a tall stalagmite. Carol identified the formation as the Minoan goddess of mountains and hunting. The women placed lit candles around an altar and the small goddess figurines that they had purchased at a shop. Others added stones or jewelry, while Carol poured milk and honey on their offerings and then wine and water. The women's improvised rituals reminded me of little girls setting out tea sets for their dolls. And yet in the semi-darkness of the cave, I couldn't help being touched by the solemn occasion. The amber beams of the women's flashlights wandering across the cave walls, which seemed to sweat like ripe cheese. The flashlights illuminated small carved animals in the walls, and I realized that some of the large stalactites that hung from the cave ceiling had merged with the stalagmite formations rising from the cave floor. Next to the altar was a small hole in which Minoans had dropped their offerings, and Carol and some of the women threw down small objects like worry beads or olives before we continued downward. The descent to the 3rd and 4th levels was more strenuous, and I started feeling dizzy and faint. I began to cough, an excruciatingly loud and long round of coughing that didn't stop. A woman handed me her Lutraki bottle, and I drank the water gratefully. Remember, you can always turn back, I reassured myself, although the passageway was getting narrower, so that would be hard to do. Steeling myself, I shuffled forward. Someone shone a light on my feet, and I realized we were standing on a steep cliff face. There were women in front of me and women behind me, and turning back was out of the question. I couldn't move. I began to cough again, and this time one of the guides gave me water and positioned his feet on the ledge so that his hands were touching the cave wall, and I could walk under his arms without worrying about falling. Ahead of me, some women were scooching through a hole in the stone while others crouched down and took their time. I tried not to cough and took small breaths so I wouldn't hyperventilate. When my turn came, I managed to crawl through the opening. On the other side, I found myself in a narrow passageway about the length and width of 2 staircases. Sitting on my haunches, I half slid, half crawled to what looked like a large oval room with high ceilings. We stood in total darkness, although a few of the women's flashlights were still weaving across the cave. Carol said the large reddish stalagmite that rose out of the cave floor could be the image of the goddess and suggested we sit around it. Once again, women lit candles and placed them at the feet of the stalagmite. After a few minutes of silence, Carol began to speak. She suggested we say our names and the names of our mothers and grandmothers and great-grandmothers as far back as we could remember. I heard my voice call out, "I am Susan, daughter of Jane, granddaughter of Pauline, great-granddaughter of Daisy." And then I stopped. I didn't know the names of my other female ancestors. Linking myself to them in the darkness of the cave felt strange, and I was surprised to discover I couldn't go back more than 3 generations. None of the other women could either, and I listened as they called out a few names of their female ancestors and then stopped. How extraordinary that we had to get to the bottom of a cave in Crete before we realized we didn't know much about our female lineage. Carol told us we could put more offerings at the foot of the stalagmite, and I placed the small blue glass eye. It had kept me safe after all. I'm going to end here. Thank you for listening. As Carol would say, blessed be.
Blessed be. Thank you so much, Susan. Our last speaker is Elizabeth Kennedy, an emerita professor of art at the California State University in Long Beach, a recipient of a Fulbright Scholar Fellowship at the University of Iceland. Her activities in environmental education through art have led to numerous lectures at international conferences in Europe and North America, and her writings on the subject have appeared in various publications. Her artworks have been exhibited internationally and widely collected, and she has been the recipient of many awards, most recently a Julia Margaret Cameron Award at the Cell Phone Photography category. Her book, Regarding Mono Lake, Novelty and Delight at an Inland Sea, released in 2014, received an Eric Hoffer Finalist Award in Small Press Publishing in the art category. Her most recent publication is a contribution to the anthology Feminist Pilgrimages, Journeys of Discovery. And just a reminder to everyone, please mute your mics. But welcome, Elizabeth. You're muted, Elizabeth. You get to unmute.
I get to unmute. Oh, good. I think I've done that. Do I need to go to share screen or?
If you have slides, yes.
No, I don't.
Okay, then nope, you don't need to.
Okay. Well, I am delighted to be here. Well, delight is a very strange word, but I'm honored to be here to celebrate Carol's work and life. And I have next to me, does everybody see the full screen at this point? I don't.
Yes, we see your background. Is that
okay.
Carol?
Yes, that's Carol. Okay, see, I can only see a little tiny box. So that is Carol to my left in the cave ritual, and I'm sort of channeling that. It was an extraordinary experience, as everyone has mentioned, and I want to give you just a little background of how I got there and what it did for me, because Carol was very big on your personal experience and transformation. And by the way, she approved this picture, even though she did not like having her picture taken. She said she didn't care about the back of her head. I joined Carolina's goddess pilgrimage to Crete in the fall of 2018. At the time, I was on a rather unfocused spiritual quest involving an obsession with sacred feminine imagery. My house is filled with such figurines, icons, and paintings that I've collected over time. In retrospect, and with insight gleaned from our pilgrimage visit to the 13th century Panagia Cara in Crete with its exquisite frescoes of the life of Mary, I can pinpoint the beginnings of that obsession to my Catholic upbringing. As a child, I was not connecting to the Our Father orientation of Catholicism, but I was quite enchanted by the artwork, the music, and the rituals involving candlelight and flowers. The main hall of our church featured stained glass windows depicting the apostles and other church fathers towering over the pews. But my mother always seated us in the Marian wing with its smaller stained glass windows portraying the many manifestations of Mary. As Mass was in the Latin then, it was easy to be distracted by these wondrous images. My favorite was Mary's Star of the Sea. In my child's mind, her heavenward gaze was looking for the second to the right and straight on till morning, so she could fly to Neverland to join all the marvelous characters inhabiting that island in the sky. I wondered then why there were so many Marys. I never connected that question to a spiritual quest as I drifted away from Catholicism in time and entered a life of academe for 32 years. Taking early retirement, I began to travel extensively. I was slated for a trip to Cyprus entitled Drumming for Aphrodite that unfortunately never took place, but introduced me to women's frame drumming and to Carol Christ through her book, Laughter of Aphrodite. The resonance of that book first introduced me to the idea of women-centered spirituality, and the story of Carol's passage from her stifling academic life in California to living in Greece intrigued me. In 1978, drawn to the concept of women-centric spirituality and female empowerment, Carol delivered her landmark address, Why Women Need the Goddess, followed soon after by the establishment of a women's ritual group. At that time, she states, for us, becoming a priestess means developing skill in creating ritual and taking responsibility for the survival of the group. She goes on to say, ritual participation is essential to me. Ritual connects us to each other and to the earth. Ritual is physical and nonverbal as well as verbal, and it thus opens channels of understanding that could not be reached through study alone. Carol's belief in the empowerment of ritual would become a hallmark of the pilgrimage experience in Crete. I read Channa Gallen's book, Longing for Darkness, several years earlier while trekking in Nepal. Gallen chronicles her journey from disenchantment with Catholicism to embracing the Taras of Buddhism, and finally to joining walking pilgrimages to Black Madonna shrines in Eastern Europe and elsewhere. In a blurb praising Gallen's 1990 book, Eleanor Monroe, author of On Glory Roads, said, in a great surge of invention and discovery these days, many women writers, artists, and scholars are converging upon an ancient subject, archetypes of female creativity, to which they give the name the goddess. Descending from prehistory, immanent in all cultures of the globe, she was reborn in the Christian Middle Ages as the awesome Black Madonna. I was riveted by her fluid portrayal of the goddess. A similar path from Christianity to the goddess is chronicled in Sue Monk Kidd's book, The Dance of the Dissident Daughter. The author thanks Carol Christ in the acknowledgments for an impactful pilgrimage in Crete and refers to events that took there frequently throughout her account. After her pilgrimage in Crete, she began team leading women's pilgrimages in Europe, especially in France, where she discovered a particularly resonant icon of the Black Madonna that became her inspiration. Reading Monk Kidd's tribute to Carol's pilgrimage, which I had not been aware of, I became interested in it and decided to read Carol's account of the path to its creation. Her discovery of a ruined temple to Aphrodite on the island of Lesbos led her to call herself a priestess of that goddess, embodying her in the performance of rituals there. She writes that in time, as I allowed Aphrodite's power to penetrate my blood and bones, it became more and more difficult to return to a culture that sapped the life energy I felt so strongly in Greece. Expressing her desire to have a daughter in an early ritual there, a participant who happened to be a Jungian analyst told her, I don't know whether or not you will ever have a physical daughter, but you have many spiritual daughters, and I don't think you're taking responsibility for them. This would have stung the priestess Carol believed herself to be, prompting her to consider more deeply the way she wished to build her new life in Greece. Another early ritual participant, a travel agent, had suggested to Carol that she would be perfect for leading goddess tours in Greece, a concept Carol originally rejected, then later reconsidered. She was adamant, however, that she would lead pilgrimages rather than tours, and that they would be in Minoan Crete, which she believed to have been a pre-patriarchal society. Mainland Greece was home to the Mycenaean and later cultures that Carol considered patriarchal and warlike, something she did not want associated with her pilgrimages. The travel agent who had hoped for tours to the popular sites of the Parthenon, Eleusis, and Delphi was disappointed by this turn of events. But, Carol writes, as she had no choice, she agreed to organize a goddess pilgrimage in Crete. Carol spent the next year meticulously identifying the places and course of travel she believed would provide the most transformative experiences for her spiritual daughters. Many of the aspects of her work as priestess that began in the women's group in California appear in the pilgrimage she created in Crete, such as our first introductory circle gathering in Heraklion, where we were invited to enter the liminal space of pilgrimage that would allow spiritual and emotional transformation as we journeyed through sacred landscape. We were immersed in performing the rituals that Carol considered so essential. We sang and chanted and passed cookies around on the bus, traveling to various museums and archaeological sites. We lit mesmerizing candles in the otherworldly darkness of sacred caves. We read from the lyrical poetry of Sappho and so much more. The physical and mental travels back and forth through the ages, always mindful of feminine essences gleaned from the figurines, icons, music, and poetry around us, bestowed an ineffably profound experience. And then in the Panagia Cara, I got it. It had been a slow road to understanding that all my fascination with sacred feminine imagery had been a seeking of the essence. Oh my gosh, my last page is missing. Sorry. Great. It had been a seeking of the divine feminine spirit flowing through it. A seemingly simple insight, but a powerful one. After the painstaking planning and offering of the first pilgrimage to Crete in 1993, Carol wrote, I did not know that the pilgrimage would be deeply transformative for me as well. Over 600 of her spiritual daughters experienced that deep transformation in Crete with her, including myself. Thank you.
Thank you, Elizabeth. All right, we have a few minutes left. So if you have questions for the participants, please in the chat write me, and then I will call on you and you can ask your question. And again, just when you're done, please mute yourself. Okay, Kathleen McPhillips.
Thank you so much to all the speakers. It was a really wonderful session. And Elizabeth, I just also have read all of Sue Monk Kidd's work and have loved it. And I didn't realize that I read her book about going to Greece. She went with her daughter, I think, and it was a
Right.
account. But do you know where we could find her account of engaging with Carol's work? That would be so good to read.
It was in The Dance of the Dissident Daughter.
Oh, it was. Okay.
Yeah, and it was just in the acknowledgments, but as you read it, you'll see all of the elements that she gleaned from Carol's, well-planned pilgrimage. Yeah.
Oh, thanks for that. I was thinking that Sue Monk Kidd would love this symposium. I don't know if she's here, but
Yes. She, yeah, and I know you were talking about traveling with pomegranates. Yes, that's one of the pilgrimages that she organized after Carol's.
Yeah, that's right. That was a wonderful book too. Thank you.
All right, don't have anyone else saying me, but Lauren Clark asked, do you feel that Carol Christ was a larger than life goddess reincarnate?
Is that for everybody?
Yes, it's in the question in the chat for everyone.
Would somebody else like to take that on?
Well, I think she was a kind of everyday goddess. You know, she was spectacular, and she embodied tremendous intelligence. I read the book with Judith Plasko recently, and I felt like I was reading a book by two great thinkers from the Enlightenment, only it was better because they were women and they were scholarly, but they dared to challenge the notion that you couldn't talk about your personal experience and how your religious beliefs could be shaped by your childhood. And then they challenged each other's views. It was amazing. So she's a portable goddess. We need her in our pockets.
She considered herself, she said, to be a priestess of Aphrodite who embodied Aphrodite in ritual. So you can cut, I don't know what that, how that plays out, but she was certainly a powerful woman.
Maybe add to that too, because Carol would be the first to say that any woman could embody the goddess in ritual. And it's how beautiful how you spoke about your understanding of why ritual was so important to Carol. And I think that she would certainly laugh at Lauren Clark's question about being larger than life, because as Susan so beautifully shared, that was a really important part of her journey. But I also think that Carol was, she was a human being, not a divine being, and she was flawed like every other human being. And the amazing value of that is that she then opened the door for all the rest of us flawed human beings to also find the way to encounter and embody whatever we understand to be the goddess. And this is a healing for all of that trauma that she and so many of the speakers today have described, growing up in patriarchy and the high cost of that. And Carol really found an antidote and showed the way. I think it was human work that leads us to understand that missing face of the feminine divine.
I mean, how brilliant to see the body as the portal to religious truth. We've been brought up in Christianity to escape the body. And she said to me, don't try and escape your body, inhabit it. And this whole notion of embodied spirituality, I think is so powerful. And I hope it influences our future religious studies. I mean, we really owe her a great gift. She's not the only one who is talking about embodied spirituality. Many of you are and know about it probably more than I do, but it's a really, really profound philosophy and one we badly need in the world.
Claudia asks, have you found a way to celebrate the goddess in your own lives?
Hey. I've seen in a lot of people's backgrounds statues of the goddess and candles and the sense of creating a sacred space in a home. The Minoans did that too, so I think we're carrying on that tradition, and Carol helped us understand we're part of a continuity of worship that's really home-based, body-based, kitchen-based. That's where the altars were.